My name is Dave Stewart. I have the privilege of being a pastor here, and it is my honor to bring you week 2 of our series, Overflow. I thought Pastor Kyle did a great job last week, and anytime somebody has the privilege of taking this stage and having the honor of speaking, I think it's always appropriate to honor our leaders. And so, Pastor Kyle and Pastor Jess, would you guys just stand, because you are wearing matching sweatshirts today, and I wanted to recognize you. Can we just say thank you? Kyle asked me to do that. He was like, would you please recognize us since we're wearing matching clothes? Hey, I'm excited to dive into today, and so you're in luck. We're going to talk about everybody's favorite topic, which is greed, and we're going to dive into this. And I want to say thank you for just being a generous church, being a church that we don't have to get up here every week and beg and plead and lay out some kind of desperation move that churches oftentimes do, because you are just generous. And so when we talk about things like generosity, when we approach topics like, everything you have is God's and it's on loan to you, or today when we talk about greed, I just want you to know the heart that it's coming from. It's not coming from a place of, man, we just think you're a bunch of greedy people, and we just want to hit you with this as hard as we can so that we can get more from you. This is an opportunity to just teach, what does Jesus talk about? How does he talk about this topic of greed, which is in all of our faces? It is something that we often don't talk about. And so we see this as an opportunity as a church and as leaders to simply teach God's word and what he says about all these different topics. And so we're going to dive into it in a minute, but this past week, I had the privilege of taking a few days off right after church last Sunday, and I was able to go out to Hocking Hills with my wife. We've been married for 26 years, but we have kids, and when you have kids in the fall, you realize that they all have sports, and so we wait till sports season is done so that we can kind of take a few extra days. And we just got out. Hocking Hills weather was perfect at the beginning of this week. So we got out there, we just watched the stars at night. We had a hot tub at our cabin, and so hot tub session in the morning and in the evening. We had a fire pit, so we cooked some food over the fire. We just would sit on the front porch swing and just watch the sunrise in the mornings. We just had a great time of relaxation, time together, and time really just to talk about life, talk about like the stages of life where all of our kids are at right now, and really just look at like, man, where are we at with us, and how is God wanting to use us at this season of life, and all of those things. So we were talking future, and had a great time together. But here's what I noticed. As we were sitting there in Hocking Hills, and maybe you guys do this too, whenever you get away or go on a vacation, you tend to like, man, I wonder what houses are selling for around here right now, and so you start looking, right? You start checking out the cabin prices, and like, man, we could probably get that cabin if we wanted to. I mean, we could figure out a way to make this work. And so we're in that mode, we're sitting out there, and whenever we could get cell service, we're checking out kind of the pricing of different places, and we're looking at the cabin we're in, and we're like, man, this has to be cheap. This guy just threw 3 of these on this hill, and like, man, and so we're just talking through this whole thing, right? We're building a game plan for life after kids move out and all this stuff. So we're thinking about it. And then I noticed this. As we were talking about our future, every ad that popped up on Instagram, every ad on Google, every ad on Facebook was something about buying a new home, buying a retirement house, buying in the next season of life. And like we were just like randomly searching for something, and all of a sudden, Amazon is telling us that we can buy a cabin through Amazon, and then Google's telling us that we could buy this cabin in this location because it knows exactly where we are. And all of these things are happening while we're trying to enjoy this restful, peaceful, disconnecting time together. And I'm sure you felt this before too. I'm sure this has happened to you. You were searching online for something you were interested in. You were having a conversation with someone about the newest kitchen gadget that you were wanting, or that next pair of running shoes that you were looking forward to buying, or whatever it was for you. And all of a sudden, every Google ad, every social media ad is trying to point your attention into that next thing that you think you might need. And we've all been there. This is the genius of advertisers. This is what they're gifted at doing to us, because suddenly Amazon starts suggesting all the things that you have been talking about. And it's wild because we look at that and we're like, man, that's creepy, right? Like that's just a creepy algorithm kind of thing. And it is. It is a creepy algorithm kind of thing, but it also is the thing that you and I know that we struggle with. See, here's what I want us to understand this morning, that we've all noticed this, that the moment we start to fixate on something, the moment you and I start to think about something, we start to fixate on something specific, we run the risk of becoming obsessed with it. And suddenly, every algorithm in our life is telling us about this one thing, these couple of things, this retirement cabin that you are looking forward to. And I'm sure you've noticed this. It just starts to happen everywhere. And suddenly, everywhere you look, everywhere you go, everything you see, it's all pointing you back to in this one direction. If you've ever thought about getting a car, like a new to you kind of car, you start thinking about it, and maybe you do a couple searches for it, and suddenly all the ads are popping up about why would you get a used car when you can get the new car of that version. And then suddenly you start to fixate on it, and then you start to see that car everywhere. You start to see every ad for it. You start to see every marketing billboard as you drive down the street. You start to see that car in every parking lot. Like you never even noticed it before, and now you see it everywhere. Why? Because we're slowly shifting from fixation to obsession. And it's not just your fault, because you're wired this way. This is just your human nature. This is your sin nature. But this is what this is what the enemy has figured out about you and I. How to keep pulling us back in and sucking us back into this life where we just want what we want. We want what's next. We want what's more. And it's not our intention to ever shift our focus into some particular item, but we just tend to do this because it's how we're wired. And so it's the journey from nice to have to have to have. That journey can sometimes be a very short journey because our human nature and our sin nature seemingly begin to work together. And suddenly there's something inside of us that's beginning to well up, and it's drawing us, it's pulling us in a direction that if we're not careful, it takes us down a path that we never intended to go. See, I love the statement by Dave Ramsey. He will always plead with anybody that gets involved in his systems to live like no one else now so you can live like no one else later. Live like no one else so that you can live like no one else. And it's a principle that my wife and I have really tried to adopt in our lives. When we were very young, got married, and had no money, and we just were trying to figure things out, we decided, you know what, there's just going to be a lot of stuff in life that we just say no to because we're in the long game. And not everybody thinks that way, and we're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. We're not trying to tell you to follow me as I follow Dave Ramsey. That's not my statement today, but there are things that we can decide, there are decisions that we can make early in life that will propel us into the future that God has. But here's what I've learned. I've learned that advertisers have figured this out a long time ago, that you and I have this propensity to covet. We have a propensity to want the thing that we don't have. And so we chase after it, we strive for it, we work extra hours to achieve it, and finally when we get it, what do we realize? We realize that it is not that satisfying to get. Because we immediately think, that one over there is better. Man, that's so much nicer over there. Look at what that one can do. Right? Like we get the watch and we think the watch has every bell and whistle until we meet somebody with one slightly better. And they're like, yeah, mine lights up at night. And you're like, what? Mine's trash now. I got to throw it away and buy yours. Like, who cares if it lights up at night? And so we have this mindset that we have to get because getting that is what's going to make us happy. And then we realize it doesn't. And so we don't feel complete. We don't feel happy. We don't feel satisfied. Why? Because we need more. We just want a little bit more. And so whatever we have simply isn't enough. And let's just be totally honest. Let's strip away all the masks that we tend to wear when we come to church because we want to act like we've got it all figured out. Once you get the phone, you start to think about what you don't have, right? Once you go on that vacation, you start to see all the things that you could have done on vacation that you didn't do, which would have made your vacation better. Once you get the house, once you get the relationship, once you get the piece of fitness equipment, the kitchen gadget, the gaming system, whatever it is, once you get the thing that you wanted, you quickly realize that the thing you wanted isn't really what you wanted because there's something better. Humorist Will Rogers was once asked this question: what is considered enough money? And he responded with, just a little bit more. And actually, John D. Rockefeller was asked a similar question of how much is enough, and he said, just $1 more. You see, we all know that there's this thing that we want, yet when we get it, we don't feel like it's enough, even though we thought if we could just get that, I'll be done. I'll be satisfied. I don't need to buy another pair of jeans for the rest of my life. How many men have heard that one? I'm just kidding. I don't want to pick on anybody. I'm not singling anybody out. But I think we would all agree that greed isn't a good thing. We all know this. I think we are all intelligent people. We've all figured this out, that greed isn't good. And I think we would all agree that we aren't greedy people. I don't know anybody that has ever walked up to me in all my years of pastoring. I've had people come up and share some of their deepest, darkest things in their life. They've shared some of their greatest failures. They've shared some of their greatest sins. They've shared some of the things that they have chased after, the things that they're still struggling with, their addictions, their problems. I have never in my entire life had somebody come up to me and say, you know what, Pastor, if you would pray for me, I'm just a greedy person. I've never had somebody do that. Why? Because we can't see greed in ourselves. We just can't see it because we see it in everybody else. How many of you know a greedy person? Now you're just liars. Now you're all lying. We all know greedy people, right? We all know people that are like this. And right now you're thinking of exactly who that person is. You're like, man, that person, they're never satisfied. They're always buying new stuff and they're always chasing after the next. Why? Because we can see it in other people, but we just simply don't see it in ourselves. So from time to time, we have to take a big step back, and we just have to be challenged with God's word to see the things in our life. That is what the kingdom of God is all about, right? That is what Jesus was trying to establish, that we would see things in ourselves that don't belong, and that we would work with his power and with his authority to fix those areas of our life. And so we have to understand that there's this connection between coveting and greed. Coveting is a form of greed. They are intertwined. So every act of coveting is an act of greed, but not every act of greed is an act of coveting. They're related, but coveting is a subset of greed. It's desiring the thing that somebody else has. That's coveting. Greed is just desiring more and thinking that it'll satisfy you. So they're related. And here's what we have to understand is that greed is always there. Coveting is always there. We always are wanting something else. But you could define greed in this way. It's excessive or rapacious desire, especially for wealth or possessions. That would be a working definition for you this morning. It's when we excessively want something, when there's this rapacious desire, especially for wealth or possessions. And that word rapacious, it's an interesting word because it literally means to seize or to plunder, to take something for the satisfaction of greed. And so when I hear that word rapacious, I just think of like raptors from Jurassic Park and like how every time like they would see something, they would just jump on it, they would devour it, right? Like that is this idea of what greed does in our hearts. We become rapacious towards things and we attack those things and we have to have those things. And so we will oftentimes in an excessive way, in a damaging way to the people around us, go after those things. So it's this rapacious desire for something more. This rapacious desire to find the thing that will satisfy that actually will never satisfy. But I want you to remember that word because we'll circle back around to it later. There's a passage in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 19 says this: as such is the fate of all who are greedy for money. It robs them of life. It robs them of life. That when you and I have this greed inside of our heart, when we are greedy specifically towards money, it will rob you of the life that God has intended for you. It's not that you will die. Is that it'll rob you of the best of life because your focus is just on the wrong thing. So what's the answer? What are we going to talk about this morning? What's going to guide us to this place of maybe finding some things that could help you and I in an area that is something that all of us deal with on a day-to-day basis? So how do we counteract greed and the desire for more? How do we do this? Well, there's this extreme option, which is have nothing. Just have nothing. Live off-grid. Live like a prepper. Give up all of your possessions. Live off the land. Have a need for nothing. Have a need for no one. That is an option. It's an extreme option. And if we're being truthful, it's an unhealthy option to think that you don't need anyone or anything. It's actually a form of greed because it is to the core. It's a desire it's a coveting of being alone. It's a coveting of being an outsider. It's actually not good for us. But if I'm honest, the older I get, the better it sounds. Man, I'd love to live in the middle of nowhere and talk to, I'm just kidding. No, I'm not kidding. That's actually part of my heart, but that's what I'm working on. That's what I'm working on. So that's an option, but what's the other option? What's the better option? Well, the better option is something that we'll look at, and it's something that Jesus addresses, because Jesus has something to say about this, and he's going to say it in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 12, verse 13 through 21, which we'll get to here in just a second. But I want to set the stage of where we're going to go and what Jesus is going to address, because it's really good, I believe, to understand context when we are getting into Scripture. So before we go there, let me give some context that I think will be helpful. In Luke chapters 9 through 13, our chapter is chapter 12. They're pretty long, kind of meaty chapters. They're full of a lot of great stuff. These are chapters about their critical years of Jesus' teachings. They're Jesus having confrontations with the Pharisees and the leaders of the religious law. And there's all these really impactful moments. There's a moment tucked in there where Peter finally goes to Jesus and he's like, hey, Jesus, are you saying this for us, or are you saying this for everyone? Because we're trying to figure out who you're talking to. Is this just for us? Is this for everybody? There's all these great moments in Luke 9 through 13. But their opinion, the people against Jesus, their opinion of him isn't good. And in chapter 11, it records this confrontation between Jesus and the Pharisees. And Jesus uses some pretty harsh language towards the Pharisees. He calls them wicked, he calls them unclean, and he calls them fools. It's not how you build friendships, so let's just be honest. But he's going to deal with the Pharisees by using some pretty harsh language because they were turning people away from what the truth of the gospel was really going to be all about, what this new covenant was going to be. Chapter 12 then begins with Jesus launching into a sermon to this crowd of people of what Luke would describe as thousands. And so Jesus is now talking to thousands of people. And there's still this tension in chapter 12. If you start reading chapter 12 today, I would encourage you to do it. There's this tension that I believe comes from Jesus' desire to get people to truly understand what it means to be a part of the kingdom of God and being about people and not just the religious people. And so there's this tension that's being developed. And suddenly there's an encounter that we're going to look at today in Luke chapter 12. We're going to see that there's this gap between what the people think Jesus is trying to do and what Jesus is actually trying to do. And so look at Luke chapter 12, verse 13 through 21. I'm going to read this out of the ESV translation. It'll come up on the screen as we go through it. But someone in the crowd, verse 13, says to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Feels like an odd request to a rabbi. Like, why is this man coming to a rabbi like Jesus and saying, hey, tell my brother to split the inheritance with me? Verse 14, but Jesus says to him, "Man," which I don't know about you, but I put accents on the language when I read sentences. This is just the way my brain works. So I picture it more like a man, like you got to have a little attitude with it. "Who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" And so he says to him, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness or greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And he told them a parable saying, and notice how he just switched. Notice how the language in that passage just switched. He was talking to the man who came to him very specifically with a specific question. So he was talking to him, and now he's talking to them. So you can almost picture Jesus answering the man's question directly and then turning to the crowd of thousands and addressing them with this parable. The land of a rich man produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he says to him, well, I will do this. I will tear down my barns, and I will build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and all of my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. For God said to him, fool. Again, this is like fool. Like you gotta, fool. There's no L there. There's just fool. This might be this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So all of this stuff you've been working for, now who is going to take control of what you have, you fool? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. So what in the world is happening here? This is kind of an odd encounter. There's some tension that's being formed, and Jesus is going to respond to it. So here's kind of a quick breakdown of what's happening. The person in the crowd believes that he can somehow leverage the authority of Jesus for Jesus to speak as a legal authority on a matter of inheritance, believing that somehow if he can get this rabbi to sanction splitting an inheritance, he can then have this issue settled with apparently his brother who got a bigger inheritance than him of some kind. And then he could kind of be done with his family. So what's going on? Well, the man in the crowd was actually focused not on an inheritance, but he was focused on his greed. And Jesus knew this because why? Jesus knows our hearts. So Jesus knows what the man is really after, even though he's saying, Rabbi, would you tell my brother to split the inheritance with me? He's really saying, hey, Rabbi, would you make my brother give me more because what I have is not enough? So Jesus is seeing right through the question. And Jesus' response is basically like saying, hey, we're not going there. My authority is to bring abundance to your life, and this money you seek is not going to do that. So I'm going to deal with the heart of the issue. So when he said, man, who appointed me judge and arbitrator, it's really, the question is rather obvious, isn't it? The answer to that question, it would be God. God appointed him. But that's not really the point. That's not really what he's getting at. He's saying, look, this is an earthly matter, not a spiritual one. But if you want to make it a spiritual matter, I'll go ahead and do that for you. And now we're going to have a spiritual conversation. And that's really what Jesus does in this moment. He takes an earthly matter of inheritance and he turns it into a spiritual matter of greed in our heart, the desire for more, this covetousness. And he's going to then guide the man and the rest of the crowd into a better space. So Jesus smacks him upside the face with this, for not even when one has an abundance does his life consist or is defined by his possessions. Then in typical Jesus style, he's going to dial up a parable. Parables are just made up stories, right? We all remember this from a series that we did. Parables are just stories that Jesus would use. They're not true stories or real stories, but they're stories that would relate to everyone in the crowd. They're made up stories to prove a spiritual point. And so at the heart of this story is a man with a wealth of crops. He has a ton of stuff. He has great barns. He has great houses. And he's not satisfied with what he has. So his desire is to then tear everything down to the foundations and rebuild them, but bigger and better. And I love this in the parable because he justifies this not to anyone else, but to himself. Because if he tried to justify it to other people, people would accuse him of being greedy. They would accuse him of being prideful. They would accuse him of being covetous. But rather he lies and he tells himself this kind of falsehood that it's the right thing to do. That he should get more. If he should get more, then he needs to have a place to store more. And so he's going to need bigger barns to do it. And you can write this down. This is what greed does to you. This is what greed does to me. You and I will begin to justify ourselves with things that you would never try to justify to someone else. So you will lie to yourself and start telling yourself that you need this. You know what? I deserve this. I earn this. You know, I've worked so hard to get. I should just go do this. I need bigger. I need the better. I've been driving this thing for 2 years now. Come on. And so what we do is we just start convincing ourselves and lying to ourselves of what we need. So he tells himself to eat, drink, and be merry. And when Jesus says this in the parable, he's really calling back to something that everyone in the crowd would have been familiar with. It was actually from an Old Testament passage in Ecclesiastes chapter 5. And here's what it says. It says, "Behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days of his life that God has given him, for this is his lot." In other words, life is meaningless. That is what the writer in here in Ecclesiastes, King Solomon, is trying to say. He gets to this really low point in life, and he's like, look, everything in life is meaningless. I've chased after everything, and so just eat, drink, be merry, because there's nothing else that you can do. Everything that you have will go away. Everything you work for will eventually fade away. Nothing you have is worth anything. All possessions, I've tried it. I've chased after everything. None of it brings satisfaction. Life is meaningless. And he's in this really low moment in Ecclesiastes, but he's trying to spell it out. So everybody would be familiar with that statement that Jesus is giving in the parable. Everybody would understand that it's at this moment in the narrative, there's likely people in the crowd kind of nodding their heads and thinking to themselves, yep, this makes sense. This is a pretty wise man in the story, Jesus. Like, why wouldn't he just build bigger barns if everything else is meaningless and he's got to save what he has? And so they're all kind of like with Jesus. And then Jesus flips the script, as Jesus would often do. He extends that last portion of Ecclesiastes to its logical conclusion. So what if the days that God gives you are to suddenly be over? Then what? So if you eat, drink, and be merry, and you see how much you can accumulate and how much you can possess and how much bigger and how much better and how much you can acquire, if that's really the goal of life, then let's just follow this to the end. What happens when you die? What happens suddenly when everything is called from you and your life is demanded from you? And so in the story, not only is the man called to heaven, but in a final plot twist, Jesus kind of adds, okay, you've gathered all of these things, which, by the way, you can't take with you. Now, who gets them? Who gets all of this stuff? Did you prepare for that? Did you answer that question yet? Have you thought about that? Because why? And you can fill this in. Possessions have power, and greed blinds us to the potential of our possessions. See, whether or not you agree with this, doesn't matter, it's still true. Possessions have power. The things that you have power in your life, over you, through you, they have power. But you get to choose if that power is something that is going to bring potential and help others, or if it's all intended for you. So you actually get to choose, and greed will blind you to the potential of what you have and how what you have can be a blessing to someone else. That what you have, your possessions, can be a blessing rather than a curse. And we all know that the more we have, the more stressful life becomes, the more we have to strive to protect or to store up our stuff somewhere. We know that this is true. And so the man in the story is defining happiness through objectification. He's defining happiness through finding more stuff and getting more possession. And so he's trying to define happiness and life and all these things, but things in his mind have equal joy. And if I can just have more things, I'll have more joy. And the more I have, the happier I'll be, right? Well, Jesus ends the story with this thought. The man who stores up treasure for himself is not rich toward God. So Jesus kind of puts a bow on it and says, hey, if you thought that if you had more stuff, you would just be a happier person, can I just tell you that those who store up treasure for themselves, they are not people that are rich towards God. They're not people that God is smiling back upon. And I would classify this for Jesus as like, this is a drop kick from the top turnbuckle kind of moment. Like this is hard to hear. That's a hard one. And if you fast forward a little bit, even in Luke chapter 12, verse 30 to 31, it says this, for all the nations of the world seek after these things. And your Father, your heavenly Father knows that you need them. Verse 31, instead of seeking all of these things that you think will somehow make you happy and satisfied and joyful, seek his kingdom. And what does it say? Some of these things will be added to you. Maybe a couple of those things? No. all. And all of these things will be added to you. All the things that he knows that you need will be given to you if you would just prioritize his kingdom over yours. All these things. And there's a term for this. There's actually a term in psychology, and it's called the hedonic treadmill. Hedonic treadmill. And it's this idea that, like a treadmill, you simply run in place. And the concept suggests that external gains, like wealth or status, have limited long-term impact on our overall happiness and well-being. Let me just say that again. External gains, like wealth or status, have limited long-term impact in our overall happiness and well-being. That is what has actually been discovered from psychology of how our minds work, is that we will chase after things on a treadmill, the hedonic treadmill, to gain more, but we will never, ever be satisfied. There is no long-term satisfaction in chasing those things. And it's not just psychology, it's theology. It's biblical. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, again, Solomon is saying this: he who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity. King Solomon, the richest man to ever walk the face of the earth, says, look, the person that loves money will never be satisfied with money. You cannot ever get enough. It's just $1 more is enough. You'll never be satisfied with just a little bit more. Nor he who loves wealth will ever be satisfied with his income. There's always going to be a chase for more. So remember that I said that word rapacious earlier on? I want you to just bring that back to your mind, because that word has an antonym. That word has an opposite to it. And the opposite of rapacious greed is generosity. So if the desire for more will never satisfy, if chasing after more money and a bigger paycheck and a bigger barn and more stuff and the next greatest, brightest, whatever, if that will never bring true satisfaction, then what will? It is generosity. Jesus hints at this word treasure at the end of the parable. Later into chapter 12, he says, sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And we all know, we've heard that passage. If you've been around church for a minute, you've probably heard that passage before, that where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And this is what Jesus is ultimately getting at. He's getting at the heart. Because this is not a money issue. This is not a possessions issue. This is not a you have a nice house and you should sell it issue. This is not a, well, you drive a nice car and you should get rid of your car and drive a junker car. That is not what Jesus is talking about. What Jesus is getting at is he's getting at the heart, because here's the reality, is the deceit of greed is it'll make us happy, satisfied, and secure from anxiety and fear. That is the deceit of greed. Greed will make you think that somehow if you can get more, you'll be happier and satisfied, you'll be secure from anxiety and fear. But what you don't realize is as you accumulate more, you become more fearful and more anxious and more stressed out and less happy and less satisfied and less secure. And so greed will lie to you and me that if I can just get more, if I can accumulate more, I'll finally be over all of these feelings. But King Solomon's conclusion was that chasing stuff was meaningless. Chasing stuff was hopeless. And I just want to be really, really clear, because this is an easy message to twist and then turn and tell somebody something that's not true about this church. No one is saying that having things is bad. And no one is saying that having nice things is bad. And nobody is saying that having things that you can afford that maybe somebody else can't afford is bad. Sometimes better actually is a little bit better, because it's being a good steward of what God's given to you. Maybe buying a better version of something is better because you'll spend a little bit more, but it'll last a little bit longer. So that's just being a good steward. And that's how we all understand Jesus and life. Life is not fair. Jesus was never fair. We can talk about that all day long, but please don't mishear me on this. That is not what this parable is about. Jesus is not against you having things. But what Jesus is getting to in this story is not so much of a math equation, rather a scale. It's a scale that's balancing the condition of your heart regarding the things that you have or the things that you want. See, Jesus knows what greed can do to you and me. He knows what it can do to us. He railed against the Pharisees for the greed in their own hearts, and he constantly was coming after them. Why? Because Jesus was focused on building a kingdom, not building wealth. And I would say that is the question that you have to ask yourself. Am I trying to build my kingdom, or am I trying to build the kingdom of God? If I were to get more money, if my paycheck were to double overnight, what would I do with that extra? How would I be a blessing, or would it all be for me? And if your thought process is, well, I would immediately go buy this because that's what I've been wanting, Jesus would say, just check your heart. Just check your heart. Jesus was wanting his followers to live in this place of overflow, this place of understanding that not, you shouldn't lack anything, but if you truly put everything in the right perspective, that God will give you everything that you need if you would just understand the principle and the order of things. See, if greed destroys generosity, then the only way to battle against greed is to be generous. You want to fight greed in your heart, then become a generous person. And just generous in anything, generous in what you already have, and generous in the things that you do, how you treat people, generous in your words, generous in your finances, generous in every area of life. This is what ultimately we're getting at, that if you want to destroy the grip and the power of greed in your heart, then you have to become a generous person. You start looking for ways to be a blessing to others. That's why we use this statement around here. It's why it's on the back of the new merch is palms up, fully surrendered. It's this idea that anything I have is yours, God, however you want to use it. I am palms up. I am fully surrendered to you. So what if we decide to just be people that do this? I would love for you just to think about that today. What would happen in your home? What would happen in your family if you chose to just be a generous person? What if you chose to be a generous family? What if you chose to be generous and pull your kids into that generosity towards others? What if you looked for ways to serve people and love the people around you? What if we understood that in order to move from greed to generosity, we have to reprioritize some things in our life, not just our finances, but stuff. I think it's why Jesus warns us in Luke 12:15. Beware. Guard against every kind of greed. Because life, the best life, a life of abundance, a life of full, is not measured by how much you own. You want a full life? Be a person that gives. Be a person that is just constantly generous. And I know that sounds really good. It's easy to say from here, and it's easy for me to just tell you what to do. But can I just be really practical? Can I give you like 4 things? You can write these down fast because I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. I want to give you 4 things that are extremely practical of how can I fight, how can I resist greed in my heart. Number 1, cultivate generosity. Cultivate generosity. Write down Acts 20:35. Read it later. This is Paul reminding people of one of Jesus' teachings. Acts 20:35. Set aside a portion of your income or your resource to regularly give to those in need, whether through donations, supporting local charities, or helping somebody that you know. I know people that do this. I know people that set aside a portion of their own budget to give away every month. They just budget X amount of dollars, and this is what we're going to give away every month to somebody that's in need. And we're going to find people. We're going to look for people. And so what is that doing? That's cultivating generosity. That's planning for generosity. Well, Dave, is that just budgeting? Yes, it's budgeting generosity. It's not bad. Number 2, focus on contentment. Practice gratitude every single day. It is hard to become a greedy person who is a grateful person. Because when you're just grateful all the time, when you're just thankful for what you have, you will start to realize that greed is slowly going to lose its grip in your life. Philippians chapter 4, verses 11 through 12, this is the Apostle Paul. I have learned to be content in whatever circumstance. Whether I have or whether I don't, I've just learned to be content. And if we can focus on contentment and gratitude, how do I do that? Write down every single day this month. We've started it in our home. Write one thing every single day that you're grateful for. Just what is one thing that God has done in your life that you're grateful for? Every day, write something down. In the month of November, just start writing them down. Put them in a jar if you have to. Start a group text with friends or family and just start writing down things that you're grateful for. It will change your focus and it'll start to reprioritize. Number 3, practice stewardship, not ownership. Practice stewardship, not ownership. View your resources, your time, your talent, your treasure, as things that have been entrusted to you by God for you to manage, not for you to own for yourself. It's stewardship versus ownership. That what I have, I don't own. What I have, I've been asked to be a good steward of. Psalm 24:1, write it down. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. It is all God's. And then God gives you a portion of it. And he says, I want you to be a good manager of what I've given to you. Stewardship, not ownership. Think about how you can use your skills, your resources to serve other people. Volunteer somewhere, be a part of community projects, whatever it is, but do something for someone else and use what God has given you to do it. And you slowly will start to become a good steward and start to see that what you have isn't all yours. Lastly, number 4, there's a lot that we could share, but set limits. Set limits and boundaries on material possessions. And this one's the hard one. Set limits and boundaries on material possessions and pursuits. What does that look like? Limit yourself by setting financial or lifestyle boundaries, such as a cap on unnecessary purchases every month, or practice giving up one non-essential item on a regular basis. When you start to build these practices, you start to try some things in your life, and you start to set limits and boundaries on the things that I'm trying to acquire, on the things that I'm trying to get. And they're not life essential type of things. They're just bonuses. They're extras. They're the $100 trip to Target. That's what my wife and I used to call it. Every time we went to Target, we just spent $100, and we didn't need anything. We just walked around and stuff found us. So we said, you know what? I'm just not going to go to Target anymore. We set a boundary. I haven't walked into a Target in years. Why? Because I know that every time I do, I find something that I don't need, but I'm going to buy it. I limit myself. I set boundaries on myself. You can do whatever you want. Matthew chapter 6, verses 24, Jesus says, you cannot serve both God and money. So by setting up boundaries, you are intentionally limiting money's influence on your heart. Now, how do we end today? Well, I think we have to just challenge ourselves. I hope that you can focus on just your heart towards God, your heart towards your money this week. I hope you'll think about how much you don't want to be a greedy person. And in order to not be a greedy person, you have to become a generous person. So God, how do you want me to use my generosity this week? Whether it's my time, whether it's my resource, whether it's serving somebody around me that's in need, how can I leverage my generosity this week to fight against my heart turning towards greed? And I'll be totally honest, this is much, much, much easier if you have a relationship with Jesus. Because if you don't have a relationship with Jesus, then you're not bound to any of Jesus' rules. You can spend your money however you want. You can buy whatever you want. You can live in as much debt as you want. You can be unhappy as you want. But all I can tell you is this, that a life fully committed to Jesus, palms up, fully surrendered to God, a life walking in step with Jesus is the best life that you will ever live.